The snow had been falling since Tuesday. I stood at my kitchen window, watching it cover the garden I'd spent 30 years tending, and I thought about how strange it is that beauty can arrive in the middle of the worst moments of your life. I wasn't thinking about the snow, really. I was thinking about the phone call I'd received 3 hours earlier from my daughter-in-law, the one that started with her voice breaking before she'd said a single word. My son was in the ICU at St. Michael's in Toronto. A stroke at 51. They said he might not walk again. They said the rehabilitation could take years. They said there were decisions to be made, and they were looking at me like I was supposed to know what to do, as though being his mother gave me some kind of manual for this. I was 63 years old. I'd retired from teaching elementary school the previous spring. My husband passed 8 years ago, and I'd rebuilt my life slowly, carefully, the way you rebuild anything that's been broken. I had my garden, I had my Tuesday book club, I had my little bungalow in Guelph with the green shutters my husband painted the summer before he got sick. I had just enough from his pension and my RRSP to live without worry. Not with luxury, but without worry. And then the phone rang. The rehabilitation center the hospital recommended had a 6-month waiting list through the provincial system. My son needed intensive physiotherapy starting within weeks, not months, or the window for meaningful recovery would begin to close. His wife worked part-time, and they had 2 teenagers still in school. The private facility in Mississauga that could take him immediately cost $14,000 a month. I did the math, standing in that hospital corridor, under the fluorescent lights that make everyone look like they're already half gone. I did the math, and I knew the answer before I finished. It was my daughter-in-law's aunt who mentioned the name. She said it almost as an aside, the way people mention things they don't quite believe themselves. She said there was a man, a retired industrialist, who had made quiet inquiries about someone to act as a companion during his final months. His name was Archibald Whitmore. He was 71. He was dying. I told her that was the most absurd thing I'd ever heard. She slid a business card across the table and said his solicitor had contacted her some weeks ago through a mutual acquaintance. She'd held on to it, not knowing why. Now she knew why. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark and I listened to the heat come on and go off, and I thought about my son, who used to leave me dandelions on the kitchen table when he was small, who called me every Sunday without fail, who was lying in a hospital bed 50 kilometers away with tubes in his arms and uncertainty in every direction. By morning, I had the solicitor's number dialed. His name was Mr. Fenwick, and he was precise in the way of men who have spent their careers dealing with other people's money. He explained the arrangement without embarrassment or apology. His client was in the late stages of a progressive neurological condition, a degenerative illness that had been stealing his function piece by piece for 2 years. He had perhaps 8 months, possibly less. He had no living family. He had spent his working life building Whitmore Industrial and had emerged from it with more money than he could use and no one to eat dinner with. He wanted a companion, a spouse, legally, because he also wished to leave his estate in order and had concerns about how certain assets would be treated otherwise. In exchange, all of my son's rehabilitation costs would be covered without limit, and there would be a settlement for me as well, though I told Mr. Fenwick the settlement was beside the point. He paused at that. Most people, he said carefully, found the settlement very much the point. I told him I just wanted my son to be able to walk at his daughter's graduation. There was a long silence on the line. He said he would arrange for me to meet Mr. Whitmore. The wedding was a Wednesday afternoon in Mr. Fenwick's office on King Street. February, cold enough that the windows fogged. There were no flowers except a small bunch of yellow tulips that someone, I still don't know who, had left on the reception desk. There were 2 witnesses, Mr. Fenwick himself and a woman named Mrs. Dempsey, who had been my husband's housekeeper for what turned out to be 19 years, and who was, as I would come to understand, the only person on earth who actually knew him. Archibald Whitmore sat in a motorized wheelchair. He was a tall man, even seated, broad-shouldered in the way of men who had once been physically substantial, with white hair and the particular stillness of someone who has made his peace with something enormous. His hands rested on the arms of the chair, and they trembled slightly, not from nerves, I would learn, but from the illness itself. He looked at me steadily when we were introduced and said, "I'm sorry to put you in this position," I said. "Don't be. You're helping my son." He said, "I hope I'm doing more than that." I didn't know what he meant then. The house was in Ancaster, up on the escarpment, a stone house with deep windowsills and old maple trees in the yard, whose branches that February were bare and reaching. Mrs. Dempsey drove us from the city. She was 73, sharp-eyed, with a Newfoundland accent she'd never lost despite 40 years in Ontario, and she had the gift of knowing when to talk and when to let silence do its work. She showed me to a bedroom on the upper floor with a view of the ravine. It had bookshelves and a wingback chair by the window and its own bathroom. She said, "He doesn't come upstairs anymore. The lift is broken and he refuses to have it fixed." I asked why. She said, "Because he thinks it doesn't matter." He put the matter plainly to me last month. Why fix something for 8 months of use? I told him that was a very bleak way to think. He said he was a very realistic man. She made tea in the kitchen, a big country kitchen that smelled of wood and something baking, bread maybe, or a pie. We sat at the table and she told me about him the way people talk about someone they have watched from close up for a very long time. He had been a difficult young man, she said. His first wife left after 4 years. He had thrown himself into the company the way some men throw themselves into rivers, completely and without looking to see if they can swim. By the time he came up for air, he was 62 and the company had been sold and there was a great deal of money and a house with no one in it. The illness had come 2 years ago. Corticobasal syndrome, the doctors called it. A progressive neurological disorder, uncommon, poorly understood, no treatment to stop it, only management. It had taken his balance first, then fine motor control in his right hand, then made speech sometimes effortful. His mind was entirely intact. That was, Mrs. Dempsey said, in some ways the cruelest part. The first few weeks I barely saw him. He kept to his study on the ground floor. He was not rude, exactly, but he was self-contained in a way that felt practiced, deliberate, as though he had built walls not out of cruelty but out of long habit. Mrs. Dempsey and I ate together in the kitchen most evenings. She would leave a covered plate outside his study door at 7 o'clock and collect it at 8. I visited my son every second day. The private facility was in a low building full of light, and the physiotherapists were patient and relentless in the best way. 6 weeks in, he moved his left leg with intention for the first time since the stroke. I cried in my car in the parking lot, not quietly, the ugly kind of crying that you only let yourself do when no one is watching. When I drove back to the stone house that evening, Mrs. Dempsey took one look at me and made cocoa without asking. "Good news," she said. I could tell. "He moved," I said. "He moved his leg." She sat across from me and put her hands around her mug and didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The change with my husband, with Archibald, happened because of a book. I had taken to reading in the evenings in the sitting room off the front hall. One night I was halfway through a novel I'd brought from home, and I came to a passage I wanted to say out loud, the kind of writing that feels diminished if you only read it inside your own head. I read it aloud to the empty room. I didn't hear him in the doorway until I stopped. He had wheeled himself partway down the hall and stopped. He said nothing for us. And then he said, "Who wrote that?" I told him. He said, "I haven't read her." "Is it worth starting?" I said. "You'd have to tell me at the end." That was how it began. I started reading to him in the evenings. He would sit near the window and I would sit across from him, and we would work our way through books, the way you walk through a house you are only beginning to know slowly, with attention to what is in each room. He had opinions, sharp ones, and he was not gentle with books he found dishonest. We disagreed frequently. I found I looked forward to it. He started coming to the kitchen for breakfast. Mrs. Dempsey made no comment on this, just set a third place at the table without ceremony. He told me about building the company, about the particular loneliness of a certain kind of success, about the marriage that failed, which he took full responsibility for in the particular way of people who have had a long time to think it through. He asked about my husband, about my son, about what it had been like to teach the same age of children for 32 years. I said, "You know what I loved about it? Every September was a new start, completely fresh. The same grade but different children, different things to figure out. I never got tired of September." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I could have used more Septembers." Something about that stayed with me. In the 4th month, something began to bother me. A small thing at first, the kind of thing you push aside because it doesn't fit the picture you've been given. He was getting worse faster than the trajectory the doctors had described. The neurologist had outlined a rough progression timeline at the beginning, and what I was seeing didn't match it. The tremor had spread to his left hand now. He tired more easily. Some mornings he couldn't get himself out of bed without Mrs. Dempsey's help, which hadn't been the case when I arrived. I mentioned it to Mr. Fenwick when he came by with papers for Archibald to sign. He said, "These conditions are unpredictable. The progression is rarely linear." He said it in a way that closed the topic. I noticed that. And then I noticed other things. I hadn't known this. He mentioned it himself, almost accidentally, one evening when we were talking about family. He had a younger brother who had died some years ago, and the brother had a son, now in his mid-40s. His name was never used in front of me. Archibald referred to him only as my nephew, and when I asked about him directly, Archibald's face went briefly careful in a way I hadn't seen before. He said, "We don't have much of a relationship." He said it in a way that meant, "Please don't ask further," so I didn't, but I remembered it. Mr. Fenwick came by every 2 weeks with documents, with correspondence, with supplements he said the specialist had recommended. He would leave a bag on the kitchen counter, vitamins and powders, things that he said supported neurological function. He had a warm manner with Archibald, deferential in a way that seemed designed to be noticed. One Thursday, I arrived back from visiting my son to find Archibald asleep in his chair in the study. The afternoon only half over. That was unusual. He was someone who worked in the afternoons, correspondence, calls with his accountant, the remaining threads of a life's worth of business to tie off. Mrs. Dempsey was in the kitchen, and she looked at me when I came in with an expression I couldn't quite read. I asked her how long he'd been asleep. She said, "Since just after Mr. Fenwick left." I said, "Does that happen often?" She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "More lately." That night, I found the bag of supplements on the counter, and I looked at them properly for the first time. They were unlabeled, just plain white packets, with handwritten contents in Mr. Fenwick's neat printing. Vitamin B complex, magnesium, CoQ10. Nothing unusual. But the printing on the magnesium packet looked different from the others, slightly heavier, as though it had been written at a different time. I put the packet in my coat pocket. The next morning, I drove to the McMaster Medical campus in Hamilton on an errand I didn't explain to anyone. I had a former colleague who taught there, not a doctor, but she knew people. I described what I had and what I'd been observing, the accelerated decline, the fatigue that came specifically after the supplements, the solicitor's insistence on managing the medical side directly, the nephew I didn't know about. She listened the way people listen when they are deciding whether to take something seriously. Then she said, "Leave the packet with me." She called me 4 days later. What was in the packet was not magnesium. She was very careful in how she described it. There was a compound, she said, that in small doses over an extended period would cause progressive neurological symptoms indistinguishable from a degenerative condition like the one Archibald had already been diagnosed with. The existing diagnosis provided, she said, perfect cover. His decline would look like disease progression. No one would question it. By the time he died, there would be nothing to examine except an expected death from an expected cause. I sat in my car in her parking lot for a long time. The February cold had given way to a gray March that didn't feel like progress. Then I called the police. They were cautious at first, as police tend to be when you call them with a story that sounds like something from a crime program. But my colleague faxed her preliminary findings to the detective who took my call, and something shifted. They asked me not to go back to the house alone. I told them I lived there and I was going back. Mrs. Dempsey was the one who let me in. She knew something had happened by looking at my face. I sat her down at the kitchen table and I told her everything. I watched her process it the way old people process terrible things, quietly, deeply, without the exclamations that younger people use to make the shock feel shared. When I finished, she said, "He's been coming by for 10 years, since the brother died. Since the nephew," I said, "would have started to think about what inheritance he wasn't going to receive." She folded her hands on the table. She said, "I should have seen it." I said, "You trusted him." That's not a character flaw. The police arrested Mr. Fenwick at his office on King Street the following morning. A search of his home and his office uncovered his communications with Archibald's nephew, who lived in Vancouver. There were emails. There was a timeline that made my stomach turn. They had been planning it for 14 months. The nephew would receive a substantial bequest under the existing will and had been working with Mr. Fenwick, who stood to receive a commission from the estate management, to ensure Archibald died before he reconsidered the terms. There was also evidence that Mr. Fenwick had been slowly steering Archibald's medical care, choosing doctors, managing referrals, curating the information Archibald received about his own condition. Archibald spent 12 days at Hamilton General while they ran tests, cleared the compound from his system, and put him on medication appropriate to his actual diagnosis. The corticobasal syndrome was real, the doctors confirmed. He genuinely had it, but it was earlier stage than they had been led to believe. The accelerated decline had been manufactured. He would still face the progression of his actual condition. That was still true. That was still coming. But not yet. Not for a while. I went to see him on the third day. He was sitting up in bed, the hospital light making him look younger somehow. Or perhaps it was just that the gray exhaustion he'd been wearing for months had lifted slightly. He looked at me and said, "You saved my life." I said, "Mrs. Dempsey made the tea. I just asked the right questions." He said, "No, you paid attention." No one has paid attention to me in a very long time. I didn't know what to say to that. I sat down in the chair beside him and didn't say anything, and he didn't seem to need me to. After a while he said, "I have to ask you something." He said it slowly, with the particular care he used when something mattered to him. He said, "When I came to you with this arrangement, I told myself I was simply solving a problem. Loneliness at the end is still loneliness, and I wanted someone to read with. I told myself it was practical." He stopped, started again. He said, "These months have been more than practical for me. I don't know if that's something you can hear or something you want to hear. But I have to say it because I've spent my whole life not saying things, and I don't have enough time left to keep doing that." The room was very quiet. I thought about my husband, who had been gone 8 years, who I still sometimes talked to when I was alone in the garden. I thought about how I had driven to a solicitor's office to sign papers to save my son, and hadn't thought for one moment it would lead here. I said, "I hear it." He said, "I'm still sick, you know. This changes things, but it doesn't change everything." I said, "I know that." He said, "So this is still not the arrangement you signed up for?" I said, "No, it's a different one." He looked at me steadily. He said, "Is that acceptable to you?" I thought about September, about new starts, about all the things you can't predict about a year when you're standing at the beginning of it. I said, "I think I might need a few more Septembers too." The legal proceedings took most of the year, and the nephew were both charged. The nephew had never met me. I don't think he had ever thought of me as a person, just as an inconvenience in a plan he'd been carefully constructing. His lawyer argued that he had only ever communicated with Mr. Fenwick and had no direct knowledge of the substance being administered. The court found this unpersuasive. My son walked with a cane at his daughter's school concert in November. He stood on his own for the full length of the performance. I sat 2 rows behind him, and I couldn't see the stage at all because I couldn't stop looking at him standing there. We had a quiet ceremony in the summer, Archibald and I. Not a legal ceremony, we were already legally married, but a real one, in the back garden of the stone house when the maples were in full leaf. Mrs. Dempsey made the cake. My son and his wife came. My 2 grandchildren ran around the garden and ate too much icing, and Archibald watched them with an expression I had never seen on him before, something open, something grateful. His condition progressed as conditions do. There were harder months and easier months. We read every evening still. He moved to a hospital bed in the study eventually, and I moved a chair in beside him, and we carried on. He lost more function and gained, somehow, more presence the way some people do when there's nothing left to maintain. We set up a fund before he died. His idea, though he let me shape it. It supports families navigating private rehabilitation costs when provincial wait times are too long and the resources aren't there. My son's situation, multiplied by every family without the particular strange luck we had. It's administered now through a foundation in Hamilton. I sit on the board. I go to the meetings and I argue with people and I bring shortbread, and I feel like myself in a way I hadn't expected to feel again at this age. Archibald died on a Thursday in April. The maples were just beginning. Mrs. Dempsey and I were both there, one on each side, and I held his hand and I read to him from the novel we'd been in the middle of, and I don't know if he could hear me at the end, but I read it anyway. I still live in the stone house. The garden is mine now, and I have changed it considerably. There are raised beds along the south wall and a bench under the oldest maple and a bird bath that the grandchildren picked out and that is wildly ugly and that I love completely. Sometimes I think about that Tuesday in February when the snow was falling and the phone rang and everything I thought my life was going to be changed in a single sentence. I think about how impossible it all was, how unlikely, how nothing about what followed made any logical sense. And then I think about what Archibald said to me once, early on, before either of us knew what we were becoming to each other. He said, "I have spent my whole life being sensible, and I have very little to show for it except money and a very clean study." He meant it as a joke. But I have turned it over and over in my mind in the years since, and I think it might be the truest thing he ever said. Not an argument against sense, but a reminder that sense is a floor, not a ceiling, that the life that matters gets built above it, in the places where you didn't plan to go, with people you never thought to look for, in seasons you didn't know you had left. The snow comes every winter still. I stand at the kitchen window and watch it cover the garden, and I don't think about formless things anymore. I think about all of it, every impossible piece of it, and I am grateful down to the bone.